Welcome to part 5. Part 4 we talked a little bit about encapsulation types. Not a huge subject, just be mindful that that's an end-to-end encapsulation type and has nothing to do with the LMI type that's discovered between the router and the frame relay switch. Now let's move on to the different interface types and the different DELSI configurations that you can do. And in this configuration, I took away the frame relay map commands that we configured on R1 and on R3, and I enabled inverse ARP again. So everything's back to the basic dynamic operation, right? So we know that a handful of DELSIs, whatever's available and active, is sent to the router to tell the router, here's the available DELSIs to you, right? And then R1 says, well, I need to discover what IP addresses are at the other end of that virtual circuit connection. So it uses inverse ARP. Or we did the static assignment, statically assigning a distant end IP address to a local DELSI that's reachable to that distant end IP. So let's get into the different configuration types, the different DELSI configurations that we can do. So everything's still the same, all the DELSI virtual connections are still the same. And right now we have one basically multi-point network you can kind of think about, right? We have R1 that's capable of reaching R2 and R3, and R3 capable of reaching R1 and R2, and the same for R2 to R1 and R3. So it's a full mesh multi-point network, multi-access network. So the physical interface by default, and let's bring it up. The physical interface, by default, is a multi-point interface, meaning that multiple DELSIs can be assigned to that interface, and IP to DELSI mapping can occur at multiple levels. So a distant end IP to a DELSI mapping can happen at a multiple level. But more importantly, this multi-point interface, this physical interface, typically will share the same network as the rest of the distant end virtual circuits. So just like we did here, 10.0.0.1 is on the same network as R2's 10.0.0.2 and 10.0.0.3 on the same network. So this multi-point interface by default can reach multiple DELSIs to multiple IP addresses on the same network. Now there is another type of interface, and it's called a point-to-point interface. And that interface is when you only want one DELSI assigned to that interface. But you can't do that on the physical interface because multiple DELSIs can be assigned to it. It's not a true point-to-point, although you could use it like that. I mean, if you wanted a true point-to-point, you need to create something called a logical interface on the router. And that logical interface is a sub-interface of the physical interface, serial 10. So to get to it, you need to enable encapsulation frame relay, which we have. And what we want to do is we want to enable a point-to-point, instead of this virtual circuit being a part of this multi-point physical interface network, right? We want to separate it out, this virtual circuit, as a point-to-point on a different network. So on a different IP network. So we're going to use 100.0.0.0/24. And what we'll do is and let me show you this problem first. So interface serial 1.0, I'll show you how to create it first. And to create the sub-interface, you do interface serial 10 and then dot and then the sub-interface identifier, that logical identifier, and it can be a very broad range of numbers. So I'm going to pick 100 because that's the network that we're going to configure it as. And if you do, actually let me exit out here so I show you correctly. Interface serial 10.100, right? If you do question mark, it gives you the different sub-interface types, and there's our two types. We can create another multi-point interface beyond the physical interface, or we can create a point-to-point interface, which is what we're going to do, right? 100, a multi-point interface, and IP address 100.0.0.1, 255.255.255.0. And let's go to R2, interface serial 10.100. We'll do point to point. Alright, there we go. Now let's do our do show frame map. Let's look at the frame map. And 10.0.0.1 is still assigned to that DELC 201, right? Now how do we change that? How do we get that DELC 201 and 102 to not be assigned to the physical interface anymore? We want to assign it to this point-to-point interface, this new point-to-point network that we're creating. And the way we do that is in a point-to-point interface configuration, use the frame interface DELC command. And we're on R1, so to get to R2 we need local DELC 102. Alright, let's go back to R2. We're in that subinterface. And we want to use local DELC 201 to get to R1, right? Frame relay interface DELC. Now let's look at our frame map. And we'll see here that DELC 201 is no longer assigned to the physical multi-point interface. It's now assigned to this new point-to-point interface that we created. And there's only one DELC that can be assigned to that point-to-point because it's not multi-point. Not multiple routers can't be assigned, can't be communicated to off of that point-to-point. It's just one physical virtual connection. And if we do show frame map, right? And we'll see point-to-point 102 is assigned to that logical point-to-point interface. Now if we ping 100.0.0.2 from R1, alright, we get reachability. Now, what happens when we try to ping 10.0.0.2? Well, it won't work because we're no longer assigning DELC 102 to that physical interface anymore. It's no longer a part of that multi-point network. It's now a part of this point-to-point network, which is a new network, 100.0.0.0/24. So that's the point-to-point interface. All right, it's a sub-interface, and really, why we assign the DELC to that sub-interface is because by default, all DELCs that are not assigned to a logical sub-interface are assigned to the physical interface. So it needs to know what sub-interface networks are assigned to what DELCs so that it can properly utilize inverse ARP or the frame relay map commands to map the distant end IP with the correct sub-interface and local DELC. So that's what we did here. That's all we did. We assigned DELC 102 to that logical sub-interface, which is now a new network. Now remember I told you I would tell you where you could modify the encapsulation every time it came across. And you can do that with the interface DELC command. So we're on R1 and DELC 102 connects with R2 on the distant end. If you hit your question mark, you can. This is where you can also change the encapsulation type, that LAPF header encapsulation type on the frame relay frame. This is another point. You can either A, do it on the physical interface, or B, do it for a particular interface DELC, right? You can assign it to that interface DELC, 102 IETF. So that's another way. Point-to-point interfaces, not particularly hard. So if you need to create a separate network that overlays your physical multi-point network as point-to-points, you can do that too. So I would go ahead and practice that. I'm going to get into multi-point interfaces a little bit in part 6 or part 5, whichever one this is. Let's see. In part 6, we'll get in more depth with multi-point interfaces. But just keep in mind that the logical point-to-point interfaces create, and the sub-interfaces create another layer of IP network DLC connections that you can have on top to create multiple additional networks over your physical interface. And what we'll get into the multi-point conversation is that you can even not even use the physical interface at all if you wanted to. So we'll get into that in part 6.